The Cuyahoga River was 32 feet below me when I realized the bridge could hold more than trains. I'd been running for 6 hours, not the panicked, movie-style sprinting that gets you killed inside a mile. The grinding, lung-burning trot of a man who worked structural steel for 11 years and knew exactly how many calories he had left before his legs quit. I'd crossed the Akron city line on Route 261 heading south, staying off the main corridor because I-77 had become a parking lot of abandoned cars and the things that lived between them. The November wind cut through my canvas jacket like it was cheesecloth. My boots were soaked from a drainage ditch I'd waded through behind a strip mall, where something with a caved-in face had followed me for a quarter mile before I lost it in a loading dock. I wasn't heading anywhere specific. I was heading away. That's the distinction nobody makes. When they talk about the first days, they assume everyone had a plan, a destination, a person to reach. I had a dead phone, a 16-ounce framing hammer on my belt, and a half-eaten sleeve of peanut butter crackers. The apartment I'd rented in Akron was on the second floor of a building whose first floor had stopped being safe around noon. My ex-wife lived in Columbus. My mother was in a nursing facility in Youngstown that I already knew, with the certainty of a man who understood infrastructure, had lost power hours ago. The bridge appeared around a bend where the old Norfolk Southern spur crossed the river gorge. Not a highway bridge, a railroad bridge. Built around 1917 if the riveting pattern told the truth. A Warren Truss design, 140 feet across, sitting on limestone piers that went 30 feet down to bedrock. The rails were rusted the color of old blood. Weeds grew between the ties. The line had been abandoned at least 15 years ago. No rail company markings, no maintenance tags on the steel. Just geometry and gravity, holding. I stopped on the eastern approach and looked at it the way I'd looked at 1,000 structures on 1,000 job sites, not aesthetically, structurally. The top chord was sound. The verticals showed surface corrosion, but no section loss. The gusset plates, the flat steel connectors that hold a truss together, were intact, which meant the bridge was still working as designed. The deck was open wooden ties with daylight between them. No ballast, no solid floor. You could see the river through the gaps. And that's when my brain did the thing it had been trained to do. Not survival calculation, trade calculation. A Warren Truss creates triangulated bays between the top and bottom chords. Each bay is a 3-dimensional steel box, roughly 8 feet wide, 6 feet tall, 12 feet deep. Open on the sides to the wind, but enclosed on top and bottom by the chord members. If you decked the floor of a bay with plywood or planking, you'd have a room. If you closed the windward side with tarps or salvaged material, you'd have a shelter. And if you blocked the approach on both ends of the bridge, cut the ties, remove the walkway, the only way to reach you would be a 30-foot climb up a limestone pier from the river or a 60-foot rappel from the gorge rim. The dead couldn't climb. Everyone had figured that out by the second day. They could stumble, lunge, pile against barriers, and eventually topple things by weight. But they couldn't execute sequential hand-over-hand movement. Their fingers gripped, but their brains couldn't sequence the holds. I'd watched one try to climb a chain-link fence behind the gas station on Portage Path. It grabbed the links, pulled its own weight about 2 feet. Then its left hand released while its right hand pulled, and it swung sideways and fell. A bridge 32 feet above water, with no approach except vertical steel and stone, was a castle. I stood there for maybe 40 seconds. The wind smelled like river mud, and something sharper underneath it. The chemical tang that had been drifting over the whole county since the plant fires started. Downstream, smoke rose from what I thought was the old rubber factory district. I put my hand on the first truss member. The steel was cold enough to sting. I said it out loud because I needed to hear a human voice, even my own. I can build in this. And I climbed out onto the bridge. The first night I slept in the third bay from the east end, wedged between a diagonal brace and the bottom cord, with nothing underneath me but 4 2x8 railroad ties I'd repositioned to create a crude platform. The wind was constant. The temperature dropped into the mid-20s after midnight. I lay in my canvas jacket and work pants with my arms pulled inside my sleeves, shivering in cycles, 40 minutes of shaking, 10 minutes of something like sleep, then the shaking again. I didn't care. I was alive. Before dark, I'd scouted both approaches. The east end terminated in a gravel embankment that sloped down to a county road. The west end ran into a tree line and disappeared into scrub, where the old rail bed continued toward whatever junction it had once served. Both approaches were walkable, which meant both approaches were vulnerable. But the bridge itself, the span between the piers, was suspended in air. And air was something the dead couldn't cross. The first thing I needed was to make the approaches impassable. The second thing I needed was a floor. The third thing I needed was walls against the wind. Everything after that was time. I didn't have tools beyond my framing hammer. I didn't have materials beyond what the bridge and the surrounding landscape offered. But I had something most survivors didn't. I could look at a structure and understand where the load went. I knew what a bolt could hold. I knew what a weld could take. I knew the difference between a member in tension and a member in compression. And I knew which one you could cut without killing yourself. By dawn of the second day, I'd pried the railroad ties loose from the first 20 feet of the east approach. I didn't remove them from the bridge. I stacked them across the approach like a barricade. 5 ties high, braced against the truss verticals. Each tie weighed roughly 200 pounds. I couldn't lift them. I levered them with a broken rail spike I'd found in the ballast, walking each one on its end the way you walk a refrigerator across a kitchen floor. It took 4 hours to move 8 ties. The west approach I handled differently. There was a maintenance access ladder bolted to the pier, a vertical steel ladder that went from the bridge deck down to a ledge about 10 feet above the waterline. I climbed down, inspected the bolts, and then spent an hour with my hammer and the rail spike knocking the bottom 6 rungs free. They fell into the river and disappeared. Now the ladder started 10 feet up from the ledge, reachable by a living person who could jump and pull themselves up. Unreachable by anything that couldn't. By noon, I'd eaten the last of the peanut butter crackers, and I was shaking not from cold this time, but from the calorie deficit that hits manual laborers like a wall. I needed food, which meant I needed to leave the bridge. I went east, down the embankment to the county road. The road ran through a stretch of rural, semi-industrial land, a shuttered machine shop, a propane dealer with a fenced yard, a farmhouse set back about 300 yards with a collapsed barn beside it. I watched the farmhouse for 20 minutes from behind the propane dealer's dumpster. Nothing moved. The farmhouse had been evacuated. The front door was open, closets emptied, dresser drawers pulled out. The kind of frantic packing that meant the family had loaded a car and left within minutes. But the kitchen pantry still held what panicked people overlook: a 5-pound bag of white rice, 2 cans of kidney beans, a jar of peanut butter with the seal intact, a half-full box of salt, and 6 cans of Campbell's soup. I also found, in the basement, 3 sheets of half-inch plywood, a partial roll of 10 mil plastic sheeting, a box of 3-inch deck screws, and a cordless drill with a dead battery. I carried the food in a pillowcase. The plywood I dragged 1 sheet at a time, across the field, up the embankment, and onto the bridge deck. Each trip took 30 minutes. Halfway through the third trip, I saw my first one since the strip mall. It was standing in the field about 200 yards south, near the tree line. A woman in a hospital gown, the kind that ties in the back. One of her arms hung wrong, dislocated or broken at the shoulder. She wasn't moving toward me. She was standing in the dead grass, her head tilted at that angle they all shared, like a dog hearing a frequency beyond human range. I kept dragging the plywood. She didn't follow. But I watched her the entire time, and she watched me, and the distance between us felt like a conversation neither of us wanted to finish. That night, I had a floor in the third bay. Plywood on railroad ties, screwed down with deck screws I'd driven by hand, using the framing hammer and a socket from the farmhouse garage. The plastic sheeting I'd stretched across the windward side and lashed to the truss members with wire I'd stripped from the barn's old electrical conduit. It wasn't a shelter yet. It was a platform with a windbreak. But I lay on plywood instead of steel, and the plastic cut the wind by half, and I slept in 90-minute stretches instead of 10-minute ones. At 3 a.m., I woke to a sound from below. A wet, rhythmic slapping, like a hand striking water. I crawled to the edge and looked down. The river was black. I couldn't see anything. But the sound continued for 20 minutes. Something at the base of the pier, touching the stone, trying to find a way up that didn't exist. I lay back down. My heart rate settled. The geometry held. On the fourth day, I met Darcy, and everything I thought I was building changed. I'd gone back to the county road to scout farther. The propane dealer's yard had 20-pound tanks I needed for heat, and the machine shop might have tools I could actually use. I was crouched behind the propane fence cutting a padlock with a hacksaw blade I'd scavenged from the farmhouse garage when a voice behind me said, "If you're stealing that, you're stealing it wrong." I spun with the hammer up. She was standing 12 feet away, beside the fence post, with a canvas messenger bag over one shoulder and a tire iron in her right hand. Mid-40s, short black hair grown out unevenly, glasses with a crack across the left lens. She wore a man's flannel shirt over what looked like medical scrubs, and hiking boots that were too big, the laces wrapped twice around her ankles to keep them on. "I'm not stealing it," I said, which was stupid because I obviously was. "The valve on that tank is cross-threaded," she said. "It won't open. Take the green one behind it." We stared at each other for about 5 seconds. She lowered the tire iron first. Her name was Darcy Novak. She'd been a veterinary technician at a large animal practice in Stowe, about 12 miles north. When the practice closed, meaning when the veterinarian locked the doors with the staff inside and shot himself in the office, while the waiting room filled with people who weren't people anymore. She'd broken out through a hay delivery window and walked south for 2 days. She'd been sleeping in the machine shop for 36 hours, eating canned peaches from a case she'd found in the cab of a delivery truck. "What are you building?" she asked, because she'd seen me dragging plywood across the field. I told her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know large animal anesthesia and wound management. I can suture. I can set a bone if I have to. And I'm not sleeping in that machine shop another night, because there's something in the drainage tunnel behind it, and I can hear it when the wind stops." I didn't want a partner. I want to be honest about that. The bridge was mine, not in a property sense, but in the way a craftsman owns a project. I'd seen the structure. I'd read the geometry. I'd calculated the loads and the sight lines and the vulnerability points. Every decision I'd made was coherent because it came from one mind. Adding a second person didn't double the capacity. It halved the clarity. But she knew which propane tank worked and which one didn't. And she'd said it before I asked, which meant she'd been watching me longer than I'd been watching her. "Can you climb?" I said. "I spent 11 years restraining horses. My grip strength is better than yours." She was right. I watched her scale the embankment with the messenger bag in her teeth and not slip once. I showed her the third bay, the plywood floor, the plastic windbreak, the stacked railroad ties on the east approach. She walked the length of the bridge, looking down through the gaps in the ties at the river below, and then walked back and said the thing that redirected everything. "You're building a shelter. You should be building a settlement." I told her I was building for one. "You're building for one because one is what you had. But this bridge has 16 bays on the main span. You've used one. That's 6% of available volume. If you decked and closed even half the bays, you could house 12 people with separation, storage, and workspace. The approaches are already defensible. The piers can't be climbed. The gorge gives you water and sight lines. This isn't a hiding spot. It's a footprint." I sat down on the plywood. Below us, the river moved in the dark, carrying branches and debris from upstream. The woman in the hospital gown was gone from the field. The propane tank sat between us like a green metal promise. "I'm an ironworker," I said. "I build what I can see." "Then see more of it," she said. I didn't answer, but I didn't say no. And in the grammar of those early days, silence meant yes. The next 10 days were the most physically demanding stretch of my life. And I once worked 17 consecutive shifts on a bridge rehab in Ashtabula during a lake effect storm. Darcy and I developed a division of labor that worked because neither of us tried to manage the other. I handled the structural work, decking the bays, closing the windward faces, reinforcing the approach barricades, rigging the pulley system that let us haul materials from the riverbank to the bridge deck without using the approaches. She handled logistics, scouting the surrounding area in expanding circles, cataloging everything reachable within a 2-mile radius, managing our food and water and propane consumption with a ledger she kept in a pocket notebook. We decked 4 more bays that first week. I used plywood from 3 sources: the farmhouse basement, a half-built shed behind the machine shop, and a pallet of OSB board I found in a collapsed garage a mile east along the county road. For fasteners, I salvaged deck screws, carriage bolts, and lag screws from every structure I could dismantle without drawing attention. The cordless drill battery I recharged using a car battery and an inverter Darcy found in the propane dealer's office, the first of many small electrical miracles she performed with no formal training and no hesitation. Each bay became a room. Plywood floor screwed to the railroad ties. Windward wall of plastic sheeting over plywood framing. Open sides I closed progressively with materials as I found them: corrugated metal from the barn, fiberglass panels from the machine shop roof, canvas tarps from the farm truck. Every closure was imperfect. Wind came through the joints, rain found the seams, but each bay was a discrete space, defensible by its occupant, connected to the next bay by the bridge deck, but separable if needed. I thought in bays the way I'd once thought in floors. A bay was a unit. It had a load path, a weather face, a service side, and an access point. If I standardized the framing, each bay took roughly 8 hours to close from raw bridge steel to functional shelter. Darcy timed me. She timed everything. On the 9th day, she came back from a scouting run to the east with a man and a boy. The man was Glenn Reacher, 51, a route driver for a bread company whose truck had died on the county road 3 miles out. He'd been walking with his grandson, Miles, who was 9. Miles hadn't spoken since the first day, not from injury, not from any physical limitation, but from the thing he'd seen in the bread truck's mirror when his grandfather told him not to turn around, and he turned around. Glenn didn't say what the boys saw. He said Miles stopped talking after that, and it had been 12 days. Darcy brought them to the bridge without asking me. I was on the 6th bay when I heard them on the east approach, Glenn's heavy boots on the railroad ties. The lighter sound of the boys' sneakers. Darcy's voice explaining the barricade procedure. I put down the drill and climbed to the top cord and watched them come across. Glenn was carrying a canvas duffel and a bread company warming bag full of canned goods. Miles was carrying a stuffed animal, a gray dog with a torn ear pressed against his chest with both arms. Darcy assigned them the 4th bay. She didn't ask me about that either. That night, I sat on the edge of the bridge deck with my legs hanging over the side, 32 feet above the water, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, not the territorial contraction I'd anticipated when I imagined this moment. What I felt was fear of a kind I couldn't hammer. I'd built the structure. I understood every bolt, every load path, every weak point. But I couldn't build the thing Darcy was building, the social architecture. The invisible trusses between people that determined who cooperated and who fractured. She was framing something I didn't have drawings for, and she was doing it inside my steel without asking permission. And the worst part was that she was right to do it. Glenn knew engines. He'd maintained a fleet of delivery trucks for 20 years. Within 2 days, he'd salvaged a generator from the machine shop and mounted it on the 7th bay with rubber isolation pads made from cut tires. We had electricity limited, fuel dependent, rationed, but we had it. Lights, a hot plate, the drill charger running full time. Miles didn't speak, but he followed me everywhere I worked, standing 4 feet behind me, watching. On the 3rd day, he handed me a bolt I'd dropped. On the 5th day, he held the flashlight steady while I drilled through a gusset plate in the dark. I had 4 people on my bridge, and the first snow was 8 days away. The first real snowfall came on November 21st, which was also the day I discovered that the woman in the hospital gown had not left. I'd seen her once more in the intervening days, a flash of white fabric at the tree line south of the farmhouse. Gone when I looked directly. I'd assumed she'd wandered on. The infected drifted with weather patterns and noise. They migrated south when temperatures dropped, following some thermal instinct no one understood. I'd expected the cold to clear the area. Instead, the cold concentrated them. The snow started at dawn. Big wet flakes that stuck to the steel and melted against the plastic sheeting. By noon, we had 3 inches on the bridge deck, and the temperature was falling through the 20s. I spent the morning clearing snow from the bays and reinforcing the plastic walls where the weight was pulling staples free. Glenn ran the generator to power the hot plate, and Darcy heated soup in a pot she'd scavenged from the farmhouse. At 2 p.m., Miles pulled on my sleeve and pointed downstream. There were 6 of them on the riverbank, standing in the snow at the base of the eastern pier. Not the random scatter of wanderers, a cluster, oriented toward the bridge, their faces tilted upward at that universal angle. The woman in the hospital gown was among them. So was a man in a county sheriff's uniform, his duty belt hanging empty. So was a child younger than Miles. They didn't try to climb. They stood in the snow, some of them swaying, and they watched us. The snow accumulated on their shoulders and heads. It didn't melt. Their surface temperature had dropped below freezing. They followed the sound, Darcy said. She was standing beside me, looking down. The generator, the drill. We've been making noise for 2 weeks. She was right. I'd been thinking about structure and weather and calories, and I'd forgotten acoustics. The river gorge was a natural amplifier. Sound traveled along the water, bounced off the limestone walls, and carried for miles. Every hammer strike, every drill whine, every conversation loud enough to cross a bay had been broadcasting our position downstream and upstream into the dark. "Do we stop making noise?" Glenn asked from behind us. "We can't," I said. "We need the generator for heat. We need the drill for construction. We need to talk to each other to stay sane. Silence isn't a survival strategy. It's a siege condition." "Then they'll keep coming," Darcy said. I looked at the 6 figures below. The snow was thickening. Visibility was dropping. By dark, I wouldn't be able to see the riverbank at all, which meant I wouldn't know if 6 had become 16 or 60. "The geometry still holds," I said. "They can't climb the piers. They can't reach the approaches without crossing open ground we can see. The bridge is still the bridge." "For now," Darcy said. That was the first time she said it. Not a challenge, not a prediction, just an honest annotation of the gap between structural engineering and time. Steel doesn't rot, but it fatigues. Stone doesn't fall, but ice widens its cracks. The bridge was strong, but the bridge was also 109 years old, and the thing standing at its base had nowhere else to be and no reason to leave. That night, the temperature hit 14 degrees. I lay in the 3rd bay with my sleeping bag pulled to my chin, listening to the wind sing through the truss members, a low harmonic hum that changed pitch with the gusts. The plastic walls bowed inward and snapped back. The plywood floor creaked as it contracted in the cold. From the 4th bay, I could hear Glenn whispering to Miles. The boy didn't answer. He never answered. But Glenn kept talking, a low, steady stream of words I couldn't make out. A grandfather's monologue delivered into silence, building something invisible in the dark, between 2 people in a steel box 30 feet above a frozen river. I envied him that. Not the grandson, not the love, the audience. Glenn had someone to explain himself to, even if that someone never responded. I had a bridge. The bridge didn't need explaining. It needed building, and building is a conversation with materials, not with people. And materials never talk back. Darcy was in the 5th bay, 3 feet of open air between her wall and mine. I could hear her pencil on the notebook, scratching numbers in the dark. "How long?" I said through the wall. "The propane lasts 9 days at current burn rate. The food lasts 14 if we stay at 4 people. The generator fuel lasts 6 days if we run it 8 hours. I meant the winter. The pencil stopped. Then she said, 112 days to the average last frost date in Summit County. I did the math in my head. I could build through winter. I could close every bay, insulate every wall, stack enough salvage to hold the structure together for 112 days. The engineering was possible. The arithmetic wasn't. 4 people, 14 days of food, 6 days of fuel, and an accumulating population of frozen things standing at the base of the piers, patient as geology. I closed my eyes. The bridge hummed. December came with a hard freeze that locked the river from bank to bank. The ice was 5 inches thick by the 2nd week I checked it from the bridge with a rope and a weighted probe Darcy had designed from a tire iron and paracord. 5 inches of river ice will hold a walking human. It will also hold a walking dead one. The geometry changed. Until the freeze, the river had been a moat. The only approach to the piers was along the banks, and the banks were steep, muddy, and exposed. Now the river was a highway, flat and white and unobstructed from upstream to down. Anything that reached the ice could walk directly to the base of any pier and stand there. By December 8th, the cluster at the eastern pier had grown to 19. They came from both directions, upstream from whatever remained of Akron, downstream from the rural stretches to the south. They gathered at the piers the way debris collects against a bridge footing in a flood, slowly, passively, accumulating by geometry rather than intention. They didn't try to climb. They stood on the ice in the dark, snow accumulating on their motionless forms, and they looked upward. Glenn said they looked like a congregation. I said they looked like a load. That was when I started doing the ice calculations. The weight of a human body averages 160 pounds. 19 bodies in a cluster at the base of a pier exerted roughly 3,000 pounds of static load on the ice surface in a 50-square-foot area. River ice has a bearing capacity that varies with thickness, temperature, and crystal structure, but at 5 inches and 14 degrees Fahrenheit, a conservative estimate puts the safe load at 200 pounds per square foot. 3,000 pounds on 50 square feet was 60 pounds per square foot, well within tolerance. But the cluster was growing. And ice doesn't fail gradually. It fails at once. On December 14th, I counted 31. On the 19th, 44. By Christmas morning, Darcy marked it on the calendar she'd drawn on the plywood wall of her bay. There were over 60, packed in an irregular mass around the eastern pier, standing on ice that groaned at night with sounds like a giant cracking its knuckles. When the ice breaks under them, what happens to the pier? Darcy asked. Nothing. The pier is limestone on bedrock. It's been handling ice loads for 100 years. And when 60 bodies go into the water and the current pushes them downstream, and they pile up against the next pier? I didn't answer because I hadn't thought about it. And she had. And that was happening more often. We had other problems. The propane was gone. We'd switched to a wood-burning stove Glenn fabricated from a steel drum and the chimney pipe salvaged from the farmhouse. The smoke rose from the bridge like a signal fire. More came every day, not just the dead, but the living. On December 20th, a woman named Yolanda Chen arrived at the east barricade carrying a 2-year-old girl in a hiking pack and nothing else. She was a middle school math teacher from Barberton. She'd walked 9 miles through snow following the smoke. On the 23rd, a man named Paul Weitz limped in from the west with a broken ankle and a bolt-action deer rifle. He was a farrier, a horseshoer 63 years old, built like a fire hydrant, and the first person on the bridge who could look at an animal and know what was wrong with it, besides Darcy. On the 28th, a married couple, Andre and Lissa Broom, came from the north, following the river gorge. Andre was a plumber. Lissa was a dental hygienist. They brought 2 backpacks of canned food and a road atlas with the safe routes marked in red pen. 8 people, 7 bays completed, a wood stove smoking in the cold, 60-odd dead on the ice below. And every night the bridge hummed in the wind. And every night I lay in my bay and listened to the steel talking. And every night I heard something I hadn't heard before, the sound of other people breathing in the structure I'd built, and the sound of the structure shifting under weights I hadn't calculated for. Not the physical weight, the other kind. On January 3rd, Miles spoke for the first time in 47 days. And what he said broke something in me that I'm still trying to name. We'd established routines by then, the daily architecture of survival that replaces panic with rhythm. Glenn ran the generator and the stove. Darcy managed supplies and medical needs, with Yolanda assisting. The 2-year-old, B, strapped to Yolanda's back in the hiking pack while she counted cans and calculated burn rates. Paul, despite his broken ankle set and splinted by Darcy with strips of a leather belt and 2 aluminum tent poles, sat on the east barricade with his rifle and watched. Andre worked with me on construction, his plumbing knowledge translating better to structural work than I'd expected. A man who understands water pressure and joint integrity understands load and connection. Lissa organized the bays, swept, arranged, made the spaces livable in ways that went beyond my functional minimalism. I was still building. We had 9 bays closed now, each one a refinement of the last. I developed a framing system using salvaged 2x4s and carriage bolts that attached to the truss members without welding critical. Since I had no welder and didn't want to compromise the heat-treated steel with a torch, even if I'd had one. The walls were layered corrugated metal on the outside, an air gap, plastic sheeting, and then an interior face of plywood. Each layer added insulation and wind resistance. The bays nearest the stove were warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves. The farthest bays were cold but bearable with sleeping bags. Miles had been shadowing me since the first day. He held lights, retrieved dropped fasteners, carried tools, and increasingly anticipated what I needed before I asked. He'd learned the names of every tool in my kit by watching me use them. He knew a carriage bolt from a lag screw. He could identify a tension member from a compression member by the direction of the gusset plates, which was more than most first-year apprentices managed. He did all of this without speaking. His communication was physical, a pointed finger, a held light, a tool placed in my hand. Glenn said the boy understood everything. He just couldn't find the door between understanding and speech. On January 3rd, I was hanging the windward wall on the 10th bay. I was standing on the bottom cord, reaching up to set a carriage bolt through a hole I'd drilled in the top rail, when my hammer slipped from my belt and fell. It didn't fall to the deck, it fell through a gap between the ties, spinning in the cold air, and hit the ice 32 feet below with a sound like a gunshot. I looked down. The hammer lay on the white surface of the frozen river, 20 feet from the eastern pier, where the mass of accumulated dead had grown to nearly 80. Several of them shifted at the impact. One turned its head toward the sound. The rest remained motionless, snow-covered, patient. My hammer, my framing hammer, the tool I'd carried since the first hour, the first object I'd held when I put my hand on this bridge and said I could build in it. "I'll go get it," Miles said. The words were clear, quiet, and completely ordinary, as if he'd been speaking all along, and we'd simply missed it. Glenn was in the 7th bay. I heard his breath catch through the wall, then silence. "No," I said. "You won't. I can climb down the ladder and cross the ice. They're not by the ladder. They're by the other pier." "Miles, you need it. You can't frame without it. The claw hammer from the farmhouse isn't balanced right, and you missed the nail head 1 out of 4. I've been counting." He'd been counting. 47 days of silence, and he'd been counting my miss rate. "I'll get another one," I said. "There's a hardware store in the town past the machine shop. I'll go tomorrow." "That's 7 miles. You'll be gone all day. The 11th bay won't get closed before the next storm." He was right. He was 9 years old, and he was right. And the rightness was the problem, because it meant he'd been absorbing the logic of the bridge, the arithmetic of time and material and exposure, and he was now fluent in a language I'd never intended to teach a child. The bridge had educated him. My structure had become his curriculum, and the lesson was that objects mattered more than safety, and schedules mattered more than people, and a dropped hammer was a crisis worth risking a life to resolve. I climbed down from the cord, sat on the deck in the cold, and looked at him. He was small and sharp-faced, and utterly serious. "The hammer's gone," I said. It's a thing. Things leave. But you named it, he said. I hadn't. I'd never spoken the hammer's name out loud. But I'd scratched my initials into the handle 6 years ago on a job site in Erie, and Miles had seen them. And to a 9-year-old who'd lost his voice for 47 days, initials on a handle were a name. And a name made something unkillable. And letting a named thing fall was a kind of abandonment he understood at a frequency adults couldn't hear. Glenn appeared at the edge of the 4th bay. His face was wet. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching his grandson speak. And the speaking was more important than what was said. I let the hammer go. Miles watched it lying on the ice for a long time. Then he went back to holding the flashlight while I worked, and he kept talking small things, observations, questions about bolt grades and truss geometry, and each word was a plank laid across a gap. And the gap was 47 days wide, and the bridge I'd built had nothing to do with it. The population on the ice reached 112 on January 15th. Darcy kept the count. She'd started a notebook specifically for them, a separate ledger from the supply log, written in the same precise hand, each entry dated and numbered. She recorded observable details: clothing, approximate age, visible injuries, position relative to the pier. She didn't name them. She numbered them. I asked her why. Because they were people, she said. And the last thing that happens to people shouldn't be unnumbered. The cluster had become a structural problem. 112 bodies on river ice exerted roughly 18,000 pounds of static load. The ice was now 8 inches thick. January had been brutal. Single digits most nights, below zero for a 4-day stretch that froze the inside of our water jugs. 8-inch ice could handle the weight, but the bodies weren't distributed evenly. They were packed densest around the eastern pier, concentrated in an area of maybe 200 square feet. And the load in that zone was approaching the point where the ice would start to deform rather than fracture, sagging slowly, creaking, allowing water to seep upward through the surface and weaken the crystal structure from above. I explained this to the group during our evening meeting, a nightly gathering in the 7th Bay, the warmest space, where all 8 of us sat in a circle around the stove and reported, discussed, and decided. Darcy had instituted the meetings on the 3rd day of the community's existence. I'd resisted them because I don't think well in groups and never have. But Darcy understood something I didn't: that shared information prevents the kind of private grievance that fractures small groups under pressure. The meetings weren't democracy. They were hygiene. If the ice sags enough to flood the surface around the pier, we lose visual on the base, I said. We won't be able to see if the water is undermining the footing. Is the footing at risk? Andre asked. No. It's limestone on bedrock. But the ice anchoring to the pier is what keeps the cluster in one place. If the ice breaks around the pier and refreezes in a different pattern, the bodies redistribute. They could spread to the western pier. They could drift downstream and accumulate against the railroad bridge support south of here. There's another bridge south of here, Paul said sharp. There's a highway bridge about a mile downstream. County road, 2 lanes. If the dead pile against its supports, they could create a dam effect when the spring thaw comes. That backs up water. Backed up water rises. If the river rises enough, it reaches the bottom chord, Darcy finished, which is currently 32 feet above normal water level. But a spring flood on the Cuyahoga has historically reached what, 23, 24 feet? 26.4 feet in 1913, I said. The record. So even worst case, we're 6 feet above. 6 feet above the water. But if the dead are in the water and the water is 6 feet below us, the dead are 6 feet below us. And 6 feet is reachable. The stove crackled. Wind moved through the truss above us with a sound like breath drawn through teeth. Bee was asleep in Yolanda's arms. Miles was sitting next to Glenn, his shoulder pressed against his grandfather's arm, listening with the total absorption of a child who has learned that information is survival. "What are you proposing?" Lissa asked. "I'm not proposing anything yet. I'm reporting what I see. The ice is a calendar. The dead are an accumulation. The river is a variable. Spring is an inevitability. If we're still here when the thaw comes, those 3 facts converge at this bridge." "Are we still going to be here?" Yolanda asked. I looked at Darcy. She looked at me. We'd had this conversation already, privately, on the bridge deck at midnight 2 days ago. And we'd come to no conclusion because there was no conclusion, only the choice between staying in a structure I understood and leaving for a landscape I didn't. "We're here for now," I said. "I'm building for longer." The meeting ended. People went to their bays. Glenn took Miles by the hand, and they disappeared into the dark of the 4th bay, where I could hear the murmur of the grandfather's voice resuming its nightly monologue, which now had an audience that answered. I sat by the stove and fed it a piece of oak I'd split that morning. Darcy sat across from me with her notebook. "You're building for longer," she said. "That's not a plan. That's a reflex. It's what I have. It's what you are. That's different. You build because building is your language, and when you don't know what to say, you frame another wall and call it communication. But walls aren't answers, Nate. They're punctuation." She'd never used my name before. I'd told it to her on the first day, but she'd always called me hey or you or nothing at all, addressing me by eye contact rather than language. The name hit different in the dark, beside the stove, in a structure I'd built and she'd populated. "What would an answer sound like?" I said. "It would sound like a decision about March." I looked at the stove. The oak popped and hissed. Below us, the ice groaned. "I'll think about March," I said. "Think out loud," she said. "That's what the meetings are for." February was the month the bridge stopped being mine. I noticed it in stages. The first stage was linguistic. People stopped calling it the bridge and started calling it truss. I don't know who said it first. Darcy claimed it was Lissa. Lissa said it was Miles. Miles said it was obvious. The name arrived the way names do in small communities, not by declaration but by repetition, until one morning I heard Andre say, "I'm going back to truss," while returning from a water hauling trip, and I realized the structure had a name I hadn't given it. The second stage was decorative. Lissa hung a curtain across the opening of her bay, a piece of green fabric she'd cut from a tablecloth found in a house on the county road. It served no structural function. It didn't block wind, retain heat, or improve the load path. It was beautiful, which meant it was useless by my metrics, which meant it was human by everyone else's. Within a week, every bay had something. Yolanda pinned Bee's drawings to the plywood wall with bent nails, crayon circles that might have been faces or suns or the abstracted memory of a life before. Glenn brought back a battery-powered clock from a looted pharmacy and mounted it on the truss vertical at the center of the span, so that everyone could see the time from their bay. Paul carved an animal, a horse, roughly shaped, 6 inches tall from a piece of cherry wood, and set it on the barricade, facing east, like a sentry. I watched all of this happen and felt a sensation I can only describe as tectonic. A slow shifting of the foundation beneath a structure I'd thought was permanent. The bridge was still my design. Every bolt, every deck screw, Every framing member was placed by my hand or under my direction. The engineering was mine, but the meaning was theirs, and meaning weighs more than steel, and I couldn't calculate its load. Darcy saw it happening. She'd been watching me watch them, and on the second night of February, while the temperature outside was 8 below zero, and the stove was burning hot enough to make the 7th bay almost comfortable, she said, "You look like a man standing in his own house after his kids rearranged the furniture." It's not a house. It is now. You built a bridge. They made it a house. Those are different acts, and they happened in that order, and you don't get to undo the second one, just because you only intended the first. I knew she was right. I also knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent his career reading stress patterns in steel, that the transformation wasn't cosmetic. When people name a structure, they bond to it. When they bond to it, they defend it. And when they defend it, they refuse to leave it, even when leaving is the correct structural decision. The bridge truss was becoming a home. And homes are the hardest structures to demolish, not because of their engineering, but because of their tenants. On February 11th, I walked the full span for my weekly structural inspection, a habit I'd maintained since the first week, checking every bolt, every gusset plate, every bearing point where steel met stone. I found what I'd been afraid of finding. The eastern pier cap, the limestone block at the top of the pier where the truss bears its weight, had a new crack. Hairline, vertical, running 6 inches from the bearing plate downward. I'd checked this cap every week. The crack was new. It hadn't been there 7 days ago. I knew what caused it. Thermal cycling. The bridge steel expanded in the rare daylight warmth and contracted at night, imposing a horizontal shear on the pier cap that the original engineers had accounted for with a sliding bearing plate. But the bearing plate was rusted. It hadn't slid freely in decades. The expansion and contraction was going directly into the stone, and the stone was cracking. The crack wasn't dangerous yet. It was a sentence in a language I could read, and the sentence said, "I am not forever." I didn't tell anyone. That was the moment I became a liar, and the lying was structural, and the structure was the thing I'd never lied about before. I told myself I didn't tell them because the crack wasn't critical, because I'd monitor it, because I'd design a remedy, a steel saddle plate, that would distribute the bearing load around the crack and buy us time. All of these things were true. None of them were why I stayed quiet. I stayed quiet because I knew what Darcy would say. She'd say it was March's problem arriving in February, and she'd say we needed to discuss it at the meeting, and the meeting would become a conversation about leaving truss. And the conversation about leaving would break something in the people who'd named it, curtained it, drawn on its walls, and carved horses for its barricade. I stayed quiet because I loved the bridge, and I didn't want to be the one who said it was dying. The crack grew 1/4 inch in 10 days. I measured it with a steel ruler every morning before anyone else woke up, crouching at the pier cap in the pre-dawn dark with a headlamp I kept under my sleeping bag. 1/4 inch of propagation in dense limestone under cyclical thermal load meant the crack was following a pre-existing flaw in the stone, a fossil inclusion, a bedding plane, a hidden weakness the quarrymen missed in 1916. I designed the saddle plate. I drew it on a scrap of plywood with a carpenter's pencil, 2 steel plates, each 1/4 inch thick and 14 inches wide, bolted through the pier cap above and below the crack, with a layer of neoprene rubber between the plate and the stone to allow for thermal movement. The design would arrest the crack propagation by compressing the stone around it, and it would redistribute the bearing load to intact sections of the cap. I needed 1/4 inch steel plate. I needed through bolts long enough to penetrate 30 inches of limestone. I needed neoprene, or something like it. I didn't have any of these things. I started making runs longer, more dangerous, farther from the bridge than I'd gone since December. The machine shop had steel, but nothing in the right dimensions. The propane dealer had rubber gasket material, but it was too thin. I needed an industrial source, which meant I needed the town, which was 4 miles east along the county road, and according to Paul's observations from the barricade, no longer empty. Paul had seen vehicles, not the abandoned kind, the moving kind. Trucks, at least 2, driving through the town center at irregular intervals over the past 3 weeks. Living people with gasoline and purpose. He couldn't tell more from 4 miles out through a rifle scope, but he was certain. Living people with trucks could be allies. They could also be the kind of people who took what they found. And what they'd find on the bridge was 8 people, a generator, a rifle, and a winter's worth of accumulated supplies. I told Darcy about the vehicles. I did not tell her about the crack. "We need to make contact," she said immediately. "We need to know who they are first." Those are the same sentence. You can't know who someone is from 4 miles away through a scope. Contact is information. Distance is guessing. Distance is also safety. Safety is the word you use when you mean control. You want to gather information without being seen because being seen means they know about us. And if they know about us, you can't decide unilaterally what to do about them. She was right again. She was right the way a structural engineer is right when reading a load, not by opinion, but by physics. And her physics were better than mine in every domain except steel. On February 22nd, I went to town. I went alone, over Darcy's objection and Glenn's quiet worry. I told them I was scouting for materials. I was scouting for materials. I was also scouting for information about the vehicles. And I was also looking for 1/4-inch steel plate to save a pier cap whose condition I'd hidden from every person sleeping on the bridge it supported. The town was called Marshfield. Population 800 before, population unknown now. The main street was a half-mile strip of small-town commerce hardware store, diner, post office, 2 churches, a volunteer fire station. Most of the buildings were intact. A few had burned. The diner's windows were smashed. The post office door stood open, mail scattered across the parking lot, envelopes snow-glued to the asphalt. The trucks were parked behind the fire station. 2 pickup trucks, a Ford F-250 and a Chevy Silverado, and a flatbed with a diesel tank mounted in the bed. All 3 had been recently driven. The snow around their tires was packed, not drifted. I watched from the hardware store roof for an hour. At 11 a.m., a man came out of the fire station, walked to the flatbed, and drove north. He was alone, 40-something, wearing Carhartt overalls and a blaze orange hunting cap. He didn't look like a raider. He looked like a guy going to work. I went into the hardware store through the back door. The shelves were partially stripped, batteries gone, flashlights gone, ammunition sold out, but the heavy goods remained because heavy goods require vehicles, and most people had fled on foot. I found steel plate in the welding section, 2 pieces of 3/16, not quite the 1/4-inch I'd designed for, but usable. I found masonry anchors that would serve as through bolts if I drilled oversized holes. I found a roll of EPDM rubber roofing membrane that would substitute for neoprene. I loaded a wheelbarrow and left through the back. On the county road, a mile from the bridge, I passed the flatbed coming the other direction. The driver, the man in the orange cap, slowed, rolled down his window and looked at me. "You from the bridge?" he said. I stopped walking. My hammer was gone. I had a box cutter in my pocket and a wheelbarrow full of steel. "Which bridge?" I said. "The one with the smoke." Of course. The stove, the smoke. We were invisible from the road, but visible from the sky. And smoke in winter is a signature no structure can conceal. "My name's Curtis Teal," he said. "I'm the fire chief," was the fire chief. "I run Marshfield now, or what's left of it. There's 23 of us in the high school. We've known about you since December." He said it without threat. He said it the way a neighbor mentions he's noticed your new fence, an observation, not an accusation. "How many are you?" he asked. "8, I said, because lying about it seemed worse than useless when he'd already counted our smoke. He nodded slowly. "We've been meaning to come talk to you. Kept putting it off. You know how it is. You get comfortable with who you've got, and reaching out feels like risking it." I knew exactly how it was. I was living it on the other side of the same 4 miles. "I need to get back," I said. "Come to the high school when you're ready. Bring whoever makes decisions for you. I don't make decisions for anyone." He smiled. It was the saddest smile I'd seen since the world ended. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I tell myself too." I repaired the pier cap on February 25th, working alone in the pre-dawn dark. The steel plates I bolted through the limestone with masonry anchors and the rubber membrane compressed between metal and stone. The repair was ugly industrial, visible, impossible to miss. By 7 a.m., when Darcy brought me coffee heated on the stove, she was standing on the deck looking down at the pier cap with an expression I hadn't seen before. "How long have you known?" she said. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The crack appeared mid-February. I've been monitoring it. It's thermal cycling. The bearing plate is frozen, so the expansion load goes into the stone. The saddle plate will arrest propagation and redistribute. I don't need the engineering. I need to understand why you hid a structural failure from 7 people sleeping on top of it. Because it wasn't a failure. It was a crack. Cracks are information. They tell you where the stress is. I read the information, and I acted on it. You acted on it alone. In the dark. Without telling anyone. That's not engineering. That's the thing you do when you think you're the only one whose assessment counts. She was standing above me on the deck. I was on the pier cap ledge, kneeling in snow and rust, with my hands orange from cold and my headlamp still on. The dead were below us, 120-odd by Darcy's latest count, standing on the ice in the gray morning light, motionless, snow-mantled, permanent. "The repair is sound," I said. "The repair is sound, and the decision was wrong. Both of those things are true, and you need to hold them in the same hand." I climbed back up to the deck. She didn't move away from the edge. We stood there, looking at the piers, the ice, the dead, the mountains of accumulated snow on the gorge walls. "I talked to someone from Marshfield," I said. Her expression changed. "When?" 3 days ago. Man named Curtis Teal, former fire chief, 23 people in the high school. They've known about us since December." "You hid that too." "I'm telling you now." "You're telling me now because I caught the first lie and you're managing the information cascade. That's not honesty. That's triage." She was right. I'd released the Marshfield information to dilute the pier cap revelation, spacing the confessions to minimize impact, engineering the emotional load path the same way I'd engineer a structural one. Darcy saw through it because Darcy saw through everything. And the worst part was that I needed her to see through it because I'd been unable to stop myself from hiding. That night at the meeting, I told everyone both things: the crack, the repair, and the man from Marshfield. I said them in order, plainly, without framing or mitigation. Darcy sat across the stove from me and watched. Glenn was angry in the quiet way of men who don't raise their voices because they grew up around men who did. He asked when I'd planned to tell them about the crack. I said I'd planned to tell them after the repair was complete. He asked what I'd have done if the crack had worsened before I could repair it. I said I'd have moved everyone to the western half of the span. He asked how much time that would have given us. I said I didn't know. You didn't know, he repeated. And you didn't tell us. And you didn't know. Those two things together are what gets people killed, Nate. Miles was sitting beside Glenn. He said nothing. But he was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the same expression he'd worn when the hammer fell through the gap and I'd let it go. Loss. Not of the object, but of the certainty that the person holding it knew what they were doing. Paul said, "What about Marshfield?" 23 people, organized, vehicles, diesel. They're in the high school. The fire chief invited us to talk. Do we trust them? Yolanda asked. We don't know them, I said. Then we go find out, Darcy said. Not you, we. She meant herself and me together. She meant the decision-making would be shared because the information hiding had proven the alternative was dangerous. She meant the bridge was no longer my project, it was their home, and homes require collective knowledge of their flaws. I agreed because I had no right not to. On March 1st, Darcy and I walked to Marshfield. Curtis Teal's Marshfield was not what I'd imagined from a parked truck and a sad smile. The high school was a 1960s brick and cinder block building on the north edge of town. Single-story, flat-roofed, built low to the ground in the way rural schools were built to survive tornadoes. 23 people lived in the gymnasium, the cafeteria, and 3 classrooms that had been converted to sleeping quarters. They had a diesel generator, a well pump powered by a hand-crank backup, a food stockpile from 3 grocery store runs completed in November, and a perimeter fence made from school buses parked end-to-end around the building. Curtis gave us a tour. He was methodical, honest, and visibly tired. His operation was clean and functional, but it was also stagnant. They'd stopped expanding in December, stopped scouting in January, and hadn't made contact with any other group because every road out of Marshfield led through country that was thick with the dead. We've been surviving, Curtis said. We haven't been living. There's a difference, and I'm running out of the energy to pretend there isn't. Their people were skilled. An electrician, 2 farmers, a nurse, a high school shop teacher who'd fabricated most of their fortifications. What they lacked was direction, a reason to do anything beyond the day's maintenance. Curtis called it the plateau problem. They'd solved immediate survival and now sat on the solution like a lid on a pot, pressure building, with nowhere for the energy to go. Darcy asked him about medical supplies. He asked her about our water situation. Within 10 minutes, they were trading information the way I trade structural assessments, fast, precise, building a shared model. I stood in the gymnasium doorway and watched her work. She'd brought the notebook. She was drawing a map on the back page, the bridge, the river, the county road, the town, the high school. She was connecting them with lines and writing distances and travel times alongside each one. She was designing a network, and the network included the bridge as a node, not a fortress. I should have been part of that conversation. I wasn't, because I'd spent 3 weeks hiding information, and the consequence was exactly what information hiding always produces: exclusion from the trust that powers collaboration. Curtis found me in the hallway outside the gym. She's good, he said, meaning Darcy. She's the reason there are 8 of us instead of 1. You built the bridge, though. I built a structure. She built a community. Those aren't the same skill. He leaned against the wall. He was 55, maybe, with the hands of a man who'd spent decades pulling hoes and swinging axes. His wedding ring was on a chain around his neck. He didn't explain why. "We've got a problem you might be able to help with," he said. "The school roof. It's a flat membrane roof, original 1963, and it's leaking in 14 places. I've patched it with tar and plastic, but the ponding water freezes, expands, cracks the patches, and we start over every week. I need someone who understands why a structure fails, not just where it leaks. I'm an ironworker, not a roofer. You're a man who looks at a thing and sees how the load moves through it. That's what I need. The load on that roof isn't just water. It's the weight of 23 people who are starting to wonder if the ceiling is going to come down." He was asking for engineering. He was also asking for integration. If I fixed his roof, I connected the bridge and Marshfield in a material relationship that went beyond information sharing. I would have built in both places, and a builder who builds in two places belongs to both. "I'll look at it," I said. "Bring your people when you come back. All of them. We'll feed you. We've got canned chili and a woman named Sandra who makes cornbread in a Dutch oven that will make you forget what year it is." I almost said no. The reflex was fast and familiar. "Protect the bridge. Keep the group tight. Don't let the population disperse, because dispersed populations are vulnerable." The ironworker's instinct: consolidate the load. But I looked back through the doorway and saw Darcy drawing her map. And Miles, who I'd brought because he'd refused to stay behind, sitting on the gymnasium floor talking to a girl roughly his own age about the stuffed gray dog he still carried everywhere. And I realized the bridge wasn't consolidating anyone anymore. It was constraining them. The structure I'd built to protect 8 people was becoming the structure that limited 8 people. And the limitation wasn't physical. It was gravitational. A bridge is a thing you cross, not a thing you live on. We'd been living on a crossing for 4 months, and the verb was wrong. "I'll bring them," I said. Curtis handed me a can of chili for the walk back. It was the most aggressive act of diplomacy I'd ever received. On March 9th, the temperature reached 41 degrees, and the ice spoke. I was on the pier cap checking the saddle plate when the first crack ran through the river surface like a sentence written in lightning, a jagged line from the western bank toward the eastern pier, splitting the white sheet into 2 planes that shifted against each other with a grinding sound that carried through the stone into my hands. The dead felt it. For the first time in months, they moved not toward anything, but in response to the surface shifting beneath their feet. The cluster at the eastern pier fragmented as the ice fractured around them. Some fell into the opening water, disappearing instantly into the black current. Others stumbled onto still frozen sections and stood swaying, arms out, like drunk navigators on a spinning deck. The woman in the hospital gown. I'd been tracking her since November, her figure recognizable by the dislocated arm and the white fabric now gray-brown with 4 months of filth, stepped into a crack and went down to her waist, the ice catching her across the ribs, and then the current pulled her under, and she was gone. Darcy was beside me. She didn't say anything. She watched the ice break with the notebook in her hand and the pencil still. "It's starting," I said. "It started in November," she said. "We're just seeing it move." Over the next week, the river went from frozen to violent. The thaw came fast, 3 consecutive days above 45 degrees. Then a rain that turned the gorge into a chute. Ice chunks the size of cars piled against the piers and broke apart with sounds like cannon fire. The dead that had accumulated all winter were carried downstream in the flood, their bodies tumbling in the brown water, bouncing off the limestone, catching on debris piles and breaking free and catching again. The water rose. 20 feet, 23, 26. On March 14th, it reached 28 feet, 2 feet higher than the 1913 record, and the bottom chord of the bridge was 4 feet above the water line. I could see them in the flood. Not the scattered, current-tumbled dead, but new ones, bodies carried from upstream, from the ruins of Akron and the towns between, delivered by the same water that had been our moat. The river wasn't protecting us anymore. It was a conveyor. A body hit the eastern pier at 3 p.m. with enough force to shake the deck. B screamed. Yolanda scooped her up and carried her to the 7th bay. Miles stood at the deck edge and watched the water with an expression I'd seen on old sailors, not fear, but respect for the thing that would kill you if you stopped paying attention. "The pier cap," Darcy said. I was already climbing down. The saddle plate was holding, the bolts were tight, the rubber membrane was intact, but the limestone around the masonry anchors was wet. Not from the river, from internal moisture freeze-thaw cycles cracking the stone's matrix, turning solid rock into gravel and waiting. The repair would hold for weeks, not months, not another winter. I climbed back up and told everyone. The meeting that night was the hardest conversation I've ever been part of, not because of anger or disagreement, but because of grief. I watched 8 people, 7, plus myself, sit in a circle around a wood stove in a steel box 30 feet above a flooding river and grieve the loss of a home that was still standing around them. Glenn asked if I could repair the pier again. I said yes. I said the repair would require steel I didn't have and a dry period long enough to work on the cap without river interference. I said the repair might buy us 1 more season, maybe 2. But not forever, he said. No structure is forever. This one was built in 1917 for trains that stopped running in 2006. It's outlived its design purpose by 20 years. It's outlived its reasonable service life by 50. What it's done for us since November is a gift from engineers who never imagined anyone would sleep in it. "So we leave," Lissa said. "We leave the bridge. We don't leave each other. Curtis has room. Marshfield has infrastructure, water, power, a building designed for long-term occupation. I've been working on their roof for 2 weeks. The building is sound. The community is functional. What they need is people, and what we need is ground." Darcy looked at me across the stove. I expected her to say something sharp, something about how I'd finally arrived at the conclusions she'd reached in December. She didn't. She said, "What do you want to do, Nate?" It was the first time anyone had asked me what I wanted, distinct from what I assessed. The question assumed I had a preference that existed outside the engineering. It assumed I was a person, not a builder. I wasn't sure I knew the difference anymore. "I want to stay," I said. "I want to stay on this bridge until the steel rusts and the stone falls and the river takes it all. I want to keep building bays and framing walls and reading the stress patterns and the truss members until I can't hold a drill. This is the best thing I ever made. Every bolt in it is mine. I can hear it in the wind, and I know what every sound means. I don't want to leave." The stove popped. The river roared. Nobody spoke. "But I have to," I said. "Because the bridge isn't mine anymore. It's yours. It's truss. And truss is failing. And the builder's job when a structure fails is to tell the truth about it and help the people inside it find the next place to stand." Miles was watching me. He had the gray dog in his lap. He said, "You can build in other places." I know. Then it's not gone. It's just somewhere else. He was 10 now. His birthday had been in January. Darcy had made a cake from pancake mix and canned peaches. He'd blown out a candle made from a twist of wax paper. And I'd given him a socket wrench set I'd found in the machine shop. And he'd held it like a treasure, which it was. The vote was 7-1. I was the one. I let the law stand. We moved to Marshfield on March 22nd. It took 3 days, not because of the distance, but because of the weight. Not material weight, the weight of leaving. Each person carried what mattered. Glenn carried the clock. Yolanda carried B's drawings peeled from the wall. Paul carried the carved horse from the barricade. Andre and Lissa carried their sleeping bags and the green curtain. Darcy carried the notebooks, all of them, the supply ledger, the dead ledger, the map. Miles carried the gray dog and the socket wrench set. I carried tools. Curtis met us on the county road with the flatbed and 2 men from the high school. They loaded the heavier materials, the generator, the stove, the remaining food stores, and drove ahead while we walked. The morning was cold, but the light was spring light, thin and sharp, casting long shadows across the snow-patched fields. I stopped at the eastern approach and looked back. The bridge stood against the gray sky the way it had for 109 years, steel and stone and geometry holding. The bays were still closed, their walls of metal and plastic and plywood flapping slightly in the wind. From a distance, it looked whole. From a distance, you couldn't see the crack in the pier cap or the frost damage on the bottom cord or the rust propagation I'd been tracking since January. From a distance, it looked like something permanent. That was the lie I'd been telling myself since November. The lie the bridge told by simply standing. Permanence is the most convincing illusion any structure offers. The bridge looked strong because it looked old. And age reads as endurance, and endurance reads as forever. But I'd been inside its steel. I knew its secrets. I knew it was 109 years into a process of returning to rust and rubble, and that everything I'd added, the plywood, the plastic, the curtains, and drawings and carved horses, had been decoration on a timeline I couldn't stop. I put my hand on the first truss member the way I'd done on the first day. The steel was cold. It was always cold. "Thank you," I said. The bridge didn't answer. It never had. That was the loneliness of building. You give your best work to materials that receive it without acknowledgement. And the acknowledgement comes from the people who use what you've made. And you have to learn to hear gratitude in the sound of someone else's footsteps on your floor. In Marshfield, Curtis had cleared the school's industrial arts wing for us. It had a wood shop, a metal shop, and a drafting room with wide tables where Darcy spread her notebooks and began building the network she'd been mapping since January. She connected the bridge truss, still to the high school, as a waypoint, a checkpoint for anyone moving along the river corridor. Not a shelter anymore, a landmark, a place where the road crossed the water and a bridge still stood. And anyone who saw the smoke gone now, but remembered, could follow the county road 4 miles to Marshfield and find people. I fixed the roof. It took 11 days. The problem was exactly what Curtis had described: a failed membrane system with chronic ponding, compounded by freeze-thaw damage and 59 years of deferred maintenance. I redesigned the drainage path, installed scuppers fabricated from sheet metal, and overlaid the worst sections with EPDM membrane from the hardware store roll I'd been too focused on the pier cap to use properly. While I worked on the roof, something happened below me in the building. The combined population, 31 people now, the original 23 plus our 8, reorganized. Not by edict, not by vote, but by the same organic process that had turned a bridge into a home. People found roles. Andre partnered with the Marshfield electrician. Darcy partnered with the nurse. Glenn ran the generators. Paul and the shop teacher redesigned the bus fence perimeter. Lissa and Sandra, the cornbread woman, who was also a former county clerk, started an inventory system that tracked every resource in the building by location, quantity, and projected consumption rate. Miles started school. There were 4 children in Marshfield, 2 girls and 2 boys, ages 7 to 12. The high school English teacher, a woman named Roberta Vance, who'd taught in the building for 28 years and refused to leave it when the evacuation came, organized classes in the library. Miles attended with the gray dog on the desk beside him, and the socket wrench set in his backpack. He raised his hand and answered questions. He'd been talking for 2 months now, but hearing his voice in a classroom, a normal voice in a normal room, doing a normal thing, hit me in a place I didn't know I had. Glenn found me on the roof that afternoon, sitting next to a finished scupper, looking north toward the river gorge where the bridge was invisible behind the tree line. "You keep looking that direction," he said. "I know. It's still standing. For now." He sat down beside me. The roof was flat and wide, and the sky was the pale blue of early spring. Somewhere south, a bird was singing the first bird song I'd heard since October. "Miles said something this morning," Glenn said. "He said the bridge taught him that things don't have to last forever to matter. He said you taught him that when you let the hammer fall." I looked at Glenn. His face was weathered and lined, older than it had been in November, but steadier. The desperate grandfather who'd carried a silent boy to a stranger's bridge was gone. In his place was a man whose grandson spoke, attended school, and philosophized about impermanence at age 10. "I didn't teach him that," I said. "The bridge did." "The bridge didn't build itself, Nate." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say the bridge was 109 years old, and I'd only occupied it for 4 months, and the engineers who designed it in 1916 deserved the credit. But that wasn't what Glenn meant. He meant the shelter, the home, the place called Truss, where a boy's voice came back and a community formed, and people hung curtains and carved horses and drew circles on plywood walls. That bridge, the human one, the one built on top of the steel one I had built, even though Darcy had populated it and the others had decorated it and Miles had named it by making it worth naming. "Yeah," I said. We sat on the roof together for a while, not talking, listening to the bird. The bridge stood through spring. I checked it weekly, then bi-weekly, then monthly, as the Marshfield network grew and my time filled with other structures. The school roof, a water tower repair, a footbridge over the drainage ditch that connected the high school grounds to the adjacent farmland we'd started cultivating in April. The pier cap crack stabilized. The saddle plate held. The bays I'd built kept their walls through the summer storms, and Darcy listed Truss on her network map as a waypoint with shelter capacity. And strangers used it passing through, sleeping one night, moving on. None of them stayed. It wasn't a staying place anymore. It was a crossing, which is what a bridge was always meant to be. I built in Marshfield. I built in the next town south when Curtis's network reached it. I built wherever someone needed a load path read or a joint repaired or a structure honest assessed. I built with other people's hands beside mine, which was slower and louder and better. I never went back to the third bay. I didn't need to. The plywood floor is probably rotting now, and the plastic walls are shredded, and the wind blows through the truss the way it did before I ever touched it. But the steel holds. The geometry is sound. And on cold nights, when the wind moves through the structure at the right speed, the bridge hums. I know because Miles told me. He listens for it.